The gate camera flickered softly on the wall-sized screen in front of me, its image crisp enough to catch every detail. 2 people stood outside the wrought-iron entrance of my estate, framed by manicured hedges and security lighting that cost more than the house I grew up in. My mother clutched her designer handbag like a lifeline, her perfectly styled hair slightly undone by desperation. My father stood beside her, shoulders hunched, eyes darting toward the intercom as if it might bite. A rental car sat awkwardly behind them, beige and anonymous, a sharp contrast to the luxury vehicles parked inside my property. "Ma'am," my head of security said quietly, "your parents are at the gate. They're claiming an emergency." I smiled. Not the kind of smile reserved for joy or kindness, but the slow, cold smile of someone who had waited 7 years for this exact moment. I didn't rush to the intercom. I didn't answer right away. I watched. I studied their posture, the impatience creeping into my mother's movements, the way my father avoided her eyes. I recognized those habits instantly. They hadn't changed. They were still exactly who they'd always been. The only thing that had changed was the balance of power. 7 years ago, they had stood in a doorway and told me I was nothing. Now they stood outside my gate, asking to be let in. That's the thing about time and silence. When you combine them with discipline and intelligence, they become weapons. What you're about to hear isn't a story about screaming matches or impulsive revenge. It's a story about patience, about watching, about building traps so carefully that the people walking into them never realize they're trapped until the door closes behind them. So ask yourself this before we go any further. What happens when the child you discarded, humiliated, and erased becomes the one who controls your fate? What happens when the person you told was worthless grows up to own the system you depend on to survive? This is not a story about anger. It's about inevitability, about consequences delivered not with rage, but with precision. Because my revenge didn't start at that gate. It started the night I lost everything. I'm Anya Vance and I'm 25 years old now. I run a company valued in the hundreds of millions. I own properties in 3 states. My signature moves markets. My silence makes people nervous. I live behind gates and security protocols because I can afford to, and because I earned the right to feel safe. But I wasn't born into this life. I built it from the absolute 0 point. To understand how I got here, you have to go back to when I was 18. Back to the night that was supposed to be my birthday. That evening, I came home from my part-time job at a bookstore expecting something simple. Maybe a grocery store cake, maybe a quiet dinner, definitely the college enrollment papers my parents and I were supposed to finalize that week. I had worked for years for that moment. Straight A's, scholarships, acceptance letters. I believed my future was finally opening. Instead, I walked into a living room that felt staged. My backpack was already packed and sitting by the door. Printed bank statements were spread neatly across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. My mother, Eleanor, stood in the center of the room, her face tight with a kind of fury I'd never seen before. My father, Arthur, sat in his recliner staring down into his coffee mug as if the answers to the universe were swirling at the bottom. She didn't ease into it. She never did. "You're a worthless mistake of my past," she said, pointing toward the door. "Get out and never come back." In the span of minutes, my entire life collapsed. She told me I wasn't my father's daughter, that I was the result of an affair she'd had 18 years earlier with a man she refused to name. She said she'd kept me out of guilt, not love. Now that I was legally an adult, her obligation was over. The college fund I'd been promised my entire life? Gone. Spent on a kitchen renovation. The enrollment papers I was waiting for? She'd called that morning and withdrawn my acceptance. I looked at my father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who sat through every school play, who called me his daughter for 18 years. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My eyes begged for him to say something. Anything. He didn't. He just muttered that Eleanor had made her decision. That silence hurt more than anything she said. The cruelest part wasn't even the revelation about my biological father. It was learning this had been planned. 6 months of fake smiles. 6 months of helping me apply to colleges she knew I'd never attend. 6 months of letting me dream about a future she had already destroyed. She handed me my backpack. Inside was exactly $47. She said it was generous, considering I wasn't really family. Then she shoved me toward the door, her manicured nails digging into my shoulder. I remember thinking, dimly, that the neighbors were probably watching. I also remember realizing she wanted them to. 20 minutes. That's how long it took to go from having a family to having nothing. When the deadbolt clicked behind me, I stood on the porch holding a life reduced to a backpack and loose change. Through the window, I saw her pour herself a glass of wine. She didn't look sad. She looked relieved. That was my 0 point. Abandonment isn't just loss, it's erasure. Overnight, I became homeless, disowned, and slandered. My mother told our town I was a drug addict who'd stolen from her. My aunt refused to open her door. My best friend emptied my savings account to protect my money. My ex-boyfriend posted humiliating photos of me online for laughs. Employers fired me after anonymous phone calls. I slept in my car, I froze, I starved, I nearly gave up. But 0 is a strange place. When you have nothing left, you also have nothing to lose. That's when rebuilding becomes possible. That's when anger transforms into focus. That's when survival sharpens into strategy. Everything I did after that night, the people I trusted, the skills I learned, the companies I built, the evidence I collected, was done with intention. I didn't want to hurt them. I wanted them to face the truth they'd buried under money and reputation. I wanted consequences so thorough they couldn't escape them. So when my security team told me my parents were at the gate, claiming emergency, I didn't feel fear or confusion. I felt completion. Because this story isn't about whether I'll let them in. It's about what happens next. The night I was thrown out didn't begin with shouting. It began with preparation. When I stepped into the living room, my backpack was already by the door, zipped and heavy, like a verdict waiting to be carried out. Printed bank statements were arranged neatly on the coffee table, aligned with surgical precision. My mother stood rigid in the center of the room, arms crossed, her expression sharp with resolve. My father sat in his recliner, eyes fixed on his mug, the same posture he used whenever he intended to disappear without leaving. Before I could speak, she told me everything, each sentence delivered without hesitation, as if she'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror for months. I wasn't my father's daughter. I was a mistake she'd kept out of obligation, not love. The college fund I'd been promised my entire life had been spent on a kitchen renovation. The acceptance letter I was waiting for had been withdrawn that morning. When I looked to my father, silently begging him to deny it, he didn't look up. He said Eleanor had made her decision. That silence cut deeper than her words. She handed me $47 and said it was generous, given I wasn't really family. Then she pushed me out the door and locked it behind me. 20 minutes was all it took to erase 18 years. Survival didn't feel heroic. It felt humiliating. My car became my bedroom, Walmart parking lots my shelter. I learned which places would let you sleep and which would knock on your window at 3 in the morning. My mother didn't stop at throwing me out. She rewrote me. In her version of events, I was a drug addict who'd stolen from her. The story spread faster than truth ever could. My aunt refused to open her door. Old family friends crossed the street when they saw me. When I went to withdraw my savings, the account was empty. My best friend Chloe had taken everything to protect it. My ex-boyfriend posted photos of me washing my hair in a gas station sink, mocking me online. I tried to work, but my mother called employers with lies about theft and addiction. I was fired again and again, handed sympathy instead of paychecks. Social exile is louder than loneliness. It tells you the world has already decided who you are. The breaking point came during a February ice storm. My car finally died, and the cold crept in slowly, cruelly. I sat there shaking, wrapped in a single blanket, wondering if my mother had been right. Worthless. Disposable. Invisible. I considered letting the cold win because fighting felt pointless. That's the thing about despair. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It tells you rest would be easier. I stumbled out of the car at dawn and walked into Clara's diner, barely upright. I had 60 cents and pride already shattered. Clara took one look at me and brought coffee, eggs, toast, and hash browns without asking. When I tried to explain I couldn't pay, she squeezed my hand and said breakfast was for people who needed a win. She gave me a job that didn't exist and a place to sleep that wasn't supposed to be offered. Dignity returned before stability. And that mattered more than she ever knew. Clara's storage room became my refuge. That's where I met Julian Thorne, a quiet man who came every morning for black coffee and wheat toast. He watched me reorganize chaos into order with color-coded notes and instinctive logic. One morning, he asked how I'd fix a scheduling nightmare at his tech company. I solved it on a napkin in 5 minutes. He stared at it like I'd just rewritten gravity. The next day, he offered me an internship. The only requirement was that I learn to code. I accepted without hesitation. Nights became lessons, mornings became work, and survival sharpened into strategy. For the first time since the door slammed behind me, my future cracked open, not from kindness, but from recognition. The man who changed everything never announced himself as important. Julian Thorne didn't wear power the way other wealthy men did. He wore plain clothes, spoke softly, and listened longer than most people talked. After he offered me the internship, he didn't ask about my past or pry into my circumstances. He only asked if I was willing to work harder than everyone else in the room. I said yes before he finished the sentence. During the day, I fetched coffee, organized files, and sat silently in meetings absorbing everything. At night, I returned to Clara's diner, ate whatever she insisted I take, and then disappeared into the storage room to teach myself how to code. I watched free tutorials until my eyes burned, rewound explanations again and again, practiced until syntax felt like a second language. I slept in 3-hour stretches, woke up soaked in exhaustion, and kept going because stopping meant falling back into nothing. Julian noticed my progress without comment. He started leaving more complex problems on my desk, asking what I thought instead of what I understood. The day he told me I wasn't an intern anymore, that I was an asset, I cried in the bathroom where no one could see me. Building from nothing is a lonely process. The storage room became my dorm, my office, my sanctuary. I taped flowcharts to the walls and stacked notebooks next to cleaning supplies. I coded between shifts, on my phone during breaks, on borrowed laptops after hours. My first real idea didn't come from ambition. It came from listening. Nurses from the hospital next door complained constantly about chaotic scheduling, missed shifts, unfair rotations, burnout. I started sketching a solution in my head, something simple but humane. an app that balanced availability, preferences, and fairness. I began building it quietly, line by line, testing it with mock data, refining it based on real complaints I overheard. When Julian caught me working on it during lunch, he didn't scold me. He asked how far along I was. Then, he asked what I needed. 2 days later, he invested $5,000 for 10% of whatever it became. That moment wasn't luck. It was leverage meeting preparation. MediShift launched without fanfare, no marketing budget, no hype, just a functional solution to a real problem. Hospitals started downloading it organically. Word spread. Within 6 months, we hit 100,000 users. I was 21, still sleeping in Clara's storage room, but suddenly my bank account held numbers I'd never seen before. Survival shifted into momentum. I hired carefully, choosing people like me, veterans, foster kids, single parents, people who understood scarcity and loyalty. We worked insane hours and believed in what we were building. When the first $1 million in revenue hit, I didn't celebrate. I bought Clara a new freezer and paid off her diner's debts anonymously. As the company grew, I erased myself. I created layered LLCs, shell corporations, and complex ownership structures that masked my identity. To the tech world, I was Av Enterprises. To my hometown, I was still the addict who disappeared. That invisibility was intentional. While I built wealth, I also built patience. I hired a private investigator who uncovered truths I'd only suspected. My mother had stolen hundreds of thousands from my grandmother while she was sick, manipulating power of attorney. More importantly, my grandmother had known. She'd left a hidden will with a clause that activated if any grandchild was abandoned before 21. I was the sole beneficiary, pending proof of independent success. I didn't rush to claim it. I waited. Because by then, I understood the most important rule of revenge: timing is everything. While MediShift expanded quietly, I began gathering evidence with the same discipline I used to build code. The private investigator's reports came in thick envelopes, each one heavier than the last. Bank records traced my mother's careful siphoning of my grandmother's money, small withdrawals over years, laundered through accounts designed to look benign. There were emails where she coached bankers on how to handle confusion, notes to doctors about memory lapses, and receipts that mapped Botox appointments to the same week's funds disappeared. The cruel irony was that my grandmother, even as dementia stole pieces of her, had left breadcrumbs of clarity. She'd anticipated betrayal and prepared a contingency. The hidden will was precise. If any grandchild was abandoned or disowned before 21, the inheritance would bypass the parents entirely upon proof of independent success. The lawyer had been searching for me for 2 years. I didn't rush to collect. Evidence isn't power until it's timed. I let it sit, complete and quiet, waiting for the moment it would matter most. Parallel to that, other truths surfaced. Bethany, the foster daughter my mother took in as a replacement, found me through a burner account. She was 17 and frightened, already sensing the hollowness behind the smiles. She sent videos filmed discreetly at dinner, my mother repeating the same lies about me, embellishing each retelling, rehearsing victimhood like a role. Bethany described chores that filled her days, expectations to perform gratitude at social events, and money that never reached her. She wasn't a daughter. She was a prop. Around the same time, Chloe, my former best friend, cracked under the weight of guilt and leverage. My mother had hired her as a personal assistant for minimum wage, dangling the stolen $3,000 like a chain. Chloe offered information in exchange for silence. I didn't absolve her. I listened. Information isn't forgiveness, It's inventory. By then, a network formed naturally, people wronged, watching, ready. The wealth explosion came on a Tuesday. The IPO cleared. By Wednesday, my net worth crossed 200 million. By Thursday, my name appeared on a list I'd never asked for, next to words like disruptor and visionary. Forbes wanted a profile. I declined interviews but knew my parents would see the headline. Panic followed predictably. They called everyone they could reach, demanding confirmation, trying to reattach themselves to a narrative they'd burned. My assistant, Jerome, who'd aged out of foster care with nothing but grit, handled the calls with calm finality. Anya Vance was unavailable indefinitely. While the noise rose, I stayed quiet and built the next piece. The financial trap required patience and proximity. 6 months earlier, I'd purchased the mortgage servicing company that held my parents' loan through layered entities that led nowhere obvious. Every payment they struggled to make, every extension they begged for, every late fee they feared, all of it passed across a desk that ultimately answered to me. I approved the extensions generously, encouraging the illusion of luck. People reveal themselves when they think fortune favors them. They took risks. They doubled down. They borrowed against hope. When the moment came, the ledger was complete. They didn't know they were reporting to the daughter they'd erased. That ignorance was essential. Traps fail when the prey senses the wire. Their desperation peaked with the illegal land deal. My father partnered with Victor Cross, a developer whose business model relied on plausible deniability. They planned to sell community land they didn't own, banking on social influence to smooth resistance. I didn't confront them. I acquired the surrounding parcels quietly, purchased the historical easement legally, and structured the sale so their paperwork unraveled under its own contradictions. When regulators asked questions, the answers pointed back to Cross. Crime collapses when it meets daylight. I didn't need to call the authorities. The system did what systems do when given the truth. By the time they reached my gate, everything was set. The foreclosure clock ticked. The crypto gamble they'd used as a lifeline imploded. Credit dried up. The Mercedes was repossessed. They arrived in a rental, clutching printouts of my success like talismans. I let them wait. When my mother called me sweetie, I told her the emergency was consequences. I applied their $47, the exact amount she'd shoved into my backpack, to their mortgage, reducing the balance by pennies. It wasn't cruelty, it was symmetry. Security escorted them away as my father begged, and my mother threatened lawsuits she couldn't afford. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Silence this time worked for me. What followed wasn't chaos, it was collapse. The embezzlement investigation began. My father filed for divorce to save himself, choosing self-preservation the way he always had. My ex-boyfriend, who'd mocked me online, lost his job in a building my company acquired. Chloe filed bankruptcy. Bethany left with a scholarship funded quietly by my foundation, a photo of her dorm taped to my fridge as proof that cycles can break. I bought my childhood home at auction and turned it into a transitional shelter for foster youth, naming rooms after Clara and Julian, the first people who fed me dignity. Justice doesn't always punish, sometimes it repurposes. While MediShift expanded quietly, I began gathering evidence with the same discipline I used to build code. The private investigators' reports came in thick envelopes, each one heavier than the last. Bank records traced my mother's careful siphoning of my grandmother's money, small withdrawals over years, laundered through accounts designed to look benign. There were emails where she coached bankers on how to handle confusion, notes to doctors about memory lapses, and receipts that mapped Botox appointments to the same week's funds disappeared. The cruel irony was that my grandmother, even as dementia stole pieces of her, had left breadcrumbs of clarity. She'd anticipated betrayal and prepared a contingency. The hidden will was precise. If any grandchild was abandoned or disowned before 21, the inheritance would bypass the parents entirely upon proof of independent success. The lawyer had been searching for me for 2 years. I didn't rush to collect. Evidence isn't power until it's timed. I let it sit, complete and quiet, waiting for the moment it would matter most. Parallel to that, other truths surfaced. Bethany, the foster daughter my mother took in as a replacement, found me through a burner account. She was 17 and frightened, already sensing the hollowness behind the smiles. She sent videos filmed discreetly at dinner, my mother repeating the same lies about me, embellishing each retelling, rehearsing victimhood like a role. Bethany described chores that filled her days, expectations to perform gratitude at social events, and money that never reached her. She wasn't a daughter, she was a prop. Around the same time, Chloe, my former best friend, cracked under the weight of guilt and leverage. My mother had hired her as a personal assistant for minimum wage, dangling the stolen $3,000 like a chain. Chloe offered information in exchange for silence. I didn't absolve her. I listened. Information isn't forgiveness, it's inventory. By then, a network formed naturally. People wronged, watching, ready. The wealth explosion came on a Tuesday. The IPO cleared. By Wednesday, my net worth crossed 200 million. By Thursday, my name appeared on a list I'd never asked for, next to words like disruptor and visionary. Forbes wanted a profile. I declined interviews but knew my parents would see the headline. Panic followed predictably. They called everyone they could reach, demanding confirmation, trying to reattach themselves to a narrative they'd burned. My assistant, Jerome, who'd aged out of foster care with nothing but grit, handled the calls with calm finality. Anya Vance was unavailable indefinitely. While the noise rose, I stayed quiet and built the next piece. The financial trap required patience and proximity. 6 months earlier, I'd purchased the mortgage servicing company that held my parents' loan through layered entities that led nowhere obvious. Every payment they struggled to make, every extension they begged for, every late fee they feared, all of it passed across a desk that ultimately answered to me. I approved the extensions generously, encouraging the illusion of luck. People reveal themselves when they think fortune favors them. They took risks. They doubled down. They borrowed against hope. When the moment came, the ledger was complete. They didn't know they were reporting to the daughter they'd erased. That ignorance was essential. Traps fail when the prey senses the wire. Their desperation peaked with the illegal land deal. My father partnered with Victor Cross, a developer whose business model relied on plausible deniability. They planned to sell community land they didn't own, banking on social influence to smooth resistance. I didn't confront them. I acquired the surrounding parcels quietly, purchased the historical easement legally, and structured the sale so their paperwork unraveled under its own contradictions. When regulators asked questions, the answers pointed back to Cross. Crime collapses when it meets daylight. I didn't need to call the authorities. The system did what systems do when given the truth. By the time they reached my gate, everything was set. The foreclosure clock ticked. The crypto gamble they'd used as a lifeline imploded. Credit dried up. The Mercedes was repossessed. They arrived in a rental, clutching printouts of my success like talismans. I let them wait. When my mother called me sweetie, I told her the emergency was consequences. I applied their $47, the exact amount she'd shoved into my backpack, to their mortgage, reducing the balance by pennies. It wasn't cruelty, it was symmetry. Security escorted them away as my father begged and my mother threatened lawsuits she couldn't afford. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Silence, this time, worked for me. What followed wasn't chaos, it was collapse. The embezzlement investigation began. My father filed for divorce to save himself, choosing self-preservation the way he always had. My ex-boyfriend, who'd mocked me online, lost his job in a building my company acquired. Chloe filed bankruptcy. Bethany left with a scholarship funded quietly by my foundation, a photo of her dorm taped to my fridge as proof that cycles can break. I bought my childhood home at auction and turned it into a transitional shelter for foster youth, naming rooms after Clara and Julian, the first people who fed me dignity. Justice doesn't always punish, sometimes it repurposes. The illegal land deal was the last move they thought would save them, and it revealed just how desperate they'd become. Victor Cross was the kind of developer who thrived in grey zones, smiling at town halls while filing paperwork no one read closely. My father believed partnering with him would convert influence into immunity. They planned to sell a sliver of protected community land using an outdated easement and a fog of favours, counting on my mother's social pull to quiet objections. I never confronted them. Confrontation warns people. Instead, I bought time and terrain. Through layered entities, I acquired adjacent parcels, commissioned an independent historical survey, and secured a clean title path that exposed the easement's limits. When the sale advanced, the contradictions surfaced on their own. Cross's signatures didn't match prior filings. Environmental reports conflicted. Regulators asked questions that demanded answers under oath. I didn't push. I let the process breathe. The deal froze, then imploded. Cross folded to save himself, handing over communications that documented the scheme in clinical detail. My parents weren't villains in a movie, they were careless conspirators in real life, and real life keeps receipts. They arrived at my gate the morning after the foreclosure notice posted. I watched them on the monitor longer than necessary, noting the way my mother rehearsed grief, the way my father's hands shook. When the intercom chimed, I answered with calm precision. They spoke in the language of entitlement, emergency, family, misunderstanding, each word an attempt to reclaim authority. I replied in facts. The loan balance, the missed payments, the extensions I'd approved, the $47. When I credited that exact amount to their account, it wasn't a joke, it was a ledger balancing. My father pleaded, my mother threatened lawsuits she couldn't fund. I told them the truth they'd taught me years earlier. Obligation ends where abuse begins. Security escorted them out as they shouted my name, and for the first time, the sound of it carried no power. The gate closed. The moment passed. There was no triumph, only relief, like a storm finally breaking offshore. Systemic collapse is quieter than people imagine. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks, it unfolds through notices, hearings, and doors that stop opening. The embezzlement investigation accelerated once my grandmother's estate lawyer produced the secondary will and the transaction map. Bank subpoenas followed. My father's divorce finalized quickly, assets divided by a court that does not care about excuses. My mother's social standing evaporated under scrutiny. Country club memberships don't survive criminal dockets. The stories she'd told unraveled publicly when Bethany's recordings surfaced, corroborated by financial records. The narrative flipped. Sympathy thinned. Accountability took its place. The ripples reached others too. My ex-boyfriend, whose cruelty had once felt personal, became incidental, terminated for cause in a building my company managed after a pattern of documented failures. Chloe's bankruptcy closed a chapter I no longer needed to read. I wished her a clean slate and kept my distance. Bethany's future unfolded in real time. Classes, a part-time job she chose, laughter that sounded unafraid. I kept my promises quietly, funding scholarships, converting my childhood home into a shelter that measured success by stability, not praise. The plaque on the wall carried two names, Clara and Julian. Gratitude doesn't need witnesses. When the dust settled, the truth emerged without my narration. Reporters asked for comment. I declined. Numbers spoke. Filings spoke. Lives rearranged themselves around facts. The lesson wasn't that power corrupts, it was that patience clarifies. I hadn't destroyed anyone. I'd stopped absorbing the damage meant for them and allowed systems, legal, financial, social, to do their work. The 0 point had been a launchpad, not a grave. I returned to Clara's diner on a quiet afternoon, sliding into the corner booth where everything had turned. Clara set a plate down without asking. We shared coffee and silence, the kind that holds. I left a check folded into a thank you note she pretended not to see. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and alive. I framed the $47 on my desk, not as a trophy, but as a compass. It reminded me where I started and why I would never confuse survival with submission again. The final signature was almost anticlimactic. The pen moved smoothly across the page, the ink drying instantly, as if the decision had been waiting years for this exact moment. Anya didn't pause, didn't hesitate, didn't feel the rush people often associated with triumph. Instead, there was a deep, grounded stillness in her chest. The address on the document was one she had memorized long before she could spell her own name. It was the house where her life had fractured quietly, where love had been conditional, where stability had been treated like a luxury she hadn't earned. For decades, that house existed as a scar, untouched, unresolved, and heavy. Now it belonged to her. Not because she needed to reclaim it emotionally, but because ownership was the final form of closure. She declined champagne. She declined congratulations. The agent mistook her calm for indifference, unaware that this moment was not about celebration. It was about authority. When Anya stepped outside, the neighborhood looked smaller than she remembered. The streets felt narrower, the fences lower, the silence less threatening. Time had stripped the place of its intimidation, and success had stripped it of its power over her. She returned the next morning alone, keys heavy in her hand. The door resisted slightly before opening, the hinge complaining in a way that felt oddly familiar. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by thin beams of sunlight. She stood there, not as the child who once waited for permission, but as the woman who now decided what this place would become. She walked through each room slowly, the living room where arguments once replaced affection, the kitchen where meals were inconsistent and tension was constant, the bedroom where she learned how to be quiet, how to disappear, how to survive. None of it hurt the way it used to. The memories were present, but they were contained. They no longer dictated her breathing or her posture. Anya understood something in that moment that had taken years to crystallize. Healing wasn't the absence of memory, it was the absence of fear attached to it. The house no longer held her. She held it. The decision came without drama. She would not renovate it into a monument to her success or a private retreat. That would have been too small, too self-centered. Instead, she imagined children like herself, children shuffled between systems, told they were temporary, treated like paperwork instead of people. She imagined a place that did not merely shelter them, but prepared them. A place that offered consistency where chaos had been normalized. That vision became non-negotiable. Renovation crews arrived weeks later, but the structure remained intact. Anya insisted on preservation, not erasure. The walls were reinforced, not demolished. The bones of the house stayed the same, as if acknowledging that survival deserved respect. Warm colors replaced the dullness. Windows were widened to invite light. Each bedroom was designed to feel permanent, not provisional. No bunk beds that suggested transience. No sterile minimalism that implied disposability. This was not a stopover. This was a foundation. When the foster youth shelter opened, it did so quietly. No ribbon-cutting ceremony. No press tour. The children arrived cautiously, carrying bags that told stories before words ever could. Anya watched from a distance at first. She saw herself in their guarded expressions, their readiness to adapt without expecting kindness. She made it clear to the staff that structure mattered as much as compassion. Rules created safety. Consistency created trust. Every child would have access to education support, therapy, mentorship, and real planning for adulthood. Aging out would not mean vanishing. Leaving would mean launching. She visited often, never announced. Sometimes she brought books. Sometimes she cooked. Sometimes she just listened. She never told them her story outright. She didn't need to. Understanding didn't require explanation. The children didn't see her as an icon or benefactor. They saw her as someone who didn't talk down to them, who respected their intelligence, who didn't flinch at their anger or retreat from their silence. Slowly, the house transformed from a shelter into a sanctuary. Laughter returned to rooms that once echoed with neglect. Futures began to form where none had been expected. The success of the shelter revealed a larger truth Anya had known all along. Individual victories meant nothing without systemic change. That understanding gave birth to the Clara, Julian Foundation. She chose the name with intention, honoring the only two people who had ever invested in her potential without expecting a return. Clara, who believed empathy was a discipline, Julian, who believed preparation was survival. Their influence had saved her in ways they never fully realized, and now their names would anchor something far larger than memory. The foundation launched with surgical precision. It focused on foster education reform, legal advocacy for displaced youth, trauma-informed therapy, and scholarships for those who began life at 0 point. Anya refused performative philanthropy. There were no galas designed to flatter donors, no speeches crafted for applause. Every dollar was tracked, every program measured. Impact was the only metric that mattered. Results spoke louder than narratives. As the foundation expanded, whispers followed. People who had once dismissed Anya as insignificant struggled to reconcile the scale of what she was building. They had expected revenge to look like exposure, humiliation, destruction. They waited for her to publicly dismantle those who had wronged her, to use her influence as a weapon. Some consequences had already unfolded naturally. Careers derailed, reputations eroded, power redistributed, but Anya never acknowledged them. Justice, she understood, did not require spectacle. It required permanence. True revenge, she realized, was not about inflicting pain. It was about rendering the original harm irrelevant. By creating systems that protected others from experiencing what she had endured, she dismantled the very conditions that allowed her suffering to exist. She didn't become bitter. She became strategic. She didn't burn bridges. She built institutions. The world had taught her early that destruction was easy. Anyone could break what already existed. Transformation, however, required discipline, patience, and vision. It required the willingness to sit with complexity instead of choosing chaos. Anya chose transformation not because it was noble, but because it was effective. Power that builds lasts longer than power that destroys. She never framed her journey as forgiveness. Forgiveness implied absolution, and that was never the goal. Accountability mattered, memory mattered, but so did progress. She refused to let the past define the boundaries of her future. Instead, she used it as raw material, refining it into something purposeful. Pain became insight. Survival became strategy. Absence became architecture. The phrase that guided everything she touched became simple and unshakable: 0 point is not the end. It's the launch pad. 0 point is where illusions dissolve, where false dependencies fall away, where clarity emerges. When you have nothing, you are free from expectation. Free from debt to narratives that were never designed for you. From 0 point, anything can be built if you're willing to do the work. As Anya's wealth grew, so did her restraint. She understood that money amplified intention, nothing more. Used carelessly, it corrupted. Used deliberately, it liberated. She chose deliberation every time. Her influence expanded not because she demanded attention, but because her systems produced undeniable outcomes. Children graduated. Laws changed. Cycles broke. Years later, when the childhood home stood fully alive, walls warm, rooms occupied, futures forming, Anya visited one evening after everyone had gone to sleep. She stood in the hallway, listening to the quiet hum of stability. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt complete. She understood then that legacy wasn't something you left behind after death. It was something you built into the present, quietly, deliberately, day after day. She had risen far beyond survival, not just into wealth, but into authorship of her own narrative. She was no longer reacting to what had been taken from her. She was deciding what would be given to others. Empowerment replaced resentment. Justice replaced chaos. Legacy replaced loss. The storm that once threatened to erase her identity became the force that sharpened it. She didn't escape the storm. She learned how to stand at its center, calm and unmovable, directing its energy instead of being consumed by it. And in that stillness, Anya claimed the final victory, not over those who wronged her, but over the limitations they had tried to assign her. What began at 0 point did not end there. It launched her into something far greater than revenge. A future defined by impact, continuity, and truth. And that, in the end, was the most calculated triumph of all.